This week on the Nittany Dispatch, we discuss Penn State's future opponents as announced by the Big Ten today. We'll talk about some media availabilities this week with Penn State's coordinators, as Audrey teased on the last episode, and we'll dip into the mailbag to answer some of your questions on this week's episode of the Nittany Dispatch. Hello, everyone, and welcome into the Nittany Dispatch. I am John Sauber, Penn State football beat reporter for the Center Daily Times. Joining me, as always, Audrey Snyder of The Athletic. Audrey, how we doing?
Well, John, we're in the midst of an interesting week here, you and I, and I'm not talking about the Big Ten schedule.
Sleep week, as I call it.
Yeah, Phillies Braves for us is a very big deal. We won't be speaking much the next few days, which is why we're doing the podcast now on Thursday. Get it out of the way, because it'll be nothing but nonstop torture for me, a Braves fan, you, a Phillies fan.
That's right.
Most of the people on the beat, a lot of Phillies fans. So it's going to be an interesting week for us.
You are right. A lot of good people on the beat, as you mentioned there. As anyone watching on YouTube can see, I'm wearing the Fightin' Phil's hoodie. I'm very excited. As Audrey
I've
sips
got
from
my
her
Braves World Series mug. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Which she likes to bring up all the time, which is fine. I'm not mad about it at all. Although I'll continue to bring up last year over and over again until I can't, which is probably about another week.
It is really, really good for us, though, that this is when the bye week happens, because
Absolutely.
had we been in a press box Saturday, this would not be good for any of us. We had that experience last year. We were in Michigan, and really, it felt like I was attending the Braves funeral during the Michigan game.
I had a great time. I don't know what you're talking about.
You guys had a great time.
I thought it was phenomenal.
We had the game on the computer, but to me, it very much felt like the season ended the night before. And, I am and you are too, John. I know this with the Eagles as well. We are as distraught sports fans as many of you listening are when it comes to Penn State. That's me with the Packers. That's me with the Braves, me with the Sixers. And I get when you guys are agonizing over losses, because it rips your heart out, and one of us is going to get our heart ripped out next week by one of our favorite baseball teams. And yeah, I did not want to see the Phillies all along because of this reason, but you know what? It's the best team in baseball, the Braves are, so time to go out and play like it. And I'm excited for Saturday night.
I know too many Braves fans for the Phillies to lose this series. For my psyche, it can't really happen.
Yeah.
Yeah,
one of us is getting emotionally tortured this week.
I always say I should not watch my favorite teams with other people. I fully understand where Penn State fans are coming from. I watched the Super Bowl alone in my basement last year because I am who I am. I didn't want to be around it. I was invited to Super Bowl parties. And just
it was at my house, and I was like, I'll invite John, but I know he's not coming because I am the same exact way. Yeah.
And my lovely wife did not bother me. She just let me stay
Your
downstairs.
Saint of a wife. Your saint of a wife, yeah.
Yes, and my poor dog upstairs losing his mind every time he heard me screaming, which was probably 4.5 straight hours, and then just the pain at the end. But I digress. There are probably plenty of Philly sports fans who listen to this pod who don't want to relive that Super Bowl, so I won't make them. If you are listening right now, feel free to rate and review on Spotify and Apple. If you are watching on YouTube, hit subscribe. That always helps us out. But yeah, this is it. You mentioned that this is a nice week for this series to be happening because it's the bye week, right? I joked it's the sleep week because I slept in a couple days. It was nice. I'm not used to it. I got a normal amount of sleep one night, yet too much another night. But I don't know. It's just it's a nice reset for us, but I think not just for us, the team. We'll get to that later, but right now,
it was still a busier week than we thought, though.
Yeah.
There was still that.
I had to do work.
Yeah. And it was, the Big Ten schedule release came out Thursday. We will go through it here, kind of hit on the high points of it. It was one of those things that we knew at some point it was going to happen. But it's also John, it's we literally just did this in June. And now we're doing it again. And my God, for our sanity and our listeners' sanity, I hope we don't have to do this again. But these were the opponents, and I shouldn't say schedule because we don't have dates and times yet, and we won't, but we know which opponents Penn State's playing. We know when they're going on the road, when they're going to be at home. But this is all because this had to take Oregon and Washington into account. So you and I are in for some good road trips next year, John. I guess
It'll
we
be some
will
fun
we will
travel.
start there. I think the biggest news, the most interesting part of this off the bat is that Penn State goes to USC at some point in 2024. So originally, I'm sure many of you remember that game was supposed to be in Beaver Stadium, but that is one that's getting tweaked. And really, the way it lays out, Penn State again has no protected rivals, so that stays true like it was the first time. So we're not getting a Land Grant Trophy game every year. We're not getting an Ohio State Penn State game every year. But for Penn State, it essentially right now amounts to one cross country road trip per season. And then in 2028, they go to Nebraska, but also go to, I believe it's USC again. That'll be the second trip to USC. So that's the only time they're really going that far across the country twice. But yeah, you and I going to USC next year. That's going to be a treat.
Yeah, not just USC either. We can talk
Mm-hmm.
about this 2024 schedule because I know you
Whew.
said you hope for the fans' sake that they don't redo this. I kind of think the fans may want them to redo 2024.
That is
Uh,
fair. Yeah, that is a
it
fair
is
point.
it's brutal. I looked at every team's schedule. Michigan has a tough schedule next year, in
Hmm.
part because they scheduled Texas on their own, and that's their own doing. But looking at the schedule or the opponents that the conference gave Penn State is just it's rough. At home, they will take on Illinois and Maryland. The two games I think you can safely pencil in as wins for Penn State. Then the other three home games: Ohio State, UCLA, Washington. Listen, Penn State's going to be very good. Those are going to
Hmm.
be close games. On the
Reminder: it
road,
will be an expanded playoff field next year, so you will
yes,
have that.
which is we'll get into that, and I think that's going to be
Hmm.
important here. On the road at Minnesota, which is never a fun environment, especially depending on the time of year, depending on the weather you're going to get there. At Purdue, which we've seen they've put together really good environments against Penn State. Still two games I think they should win. Let's call it
Hmm.
four that they should win, and then go to USC and then go to Wisconsin, a program that I think is going to be much better next year than it is this year, as Luke Fickle and Phil Longo really get rolling there on both sides of the ball. But this is like I texted a group message earlier and said like spot the fifth easy win because I don't think there is one, right? Like there's four that you look at, you feel Penn State fans should feel good
Yeah.
about. I don't know where the fifth one is.
And keep in mind too, Penn State goes to Morgantown next year to play West Virginia, so you're not getting a cakewalk there either. Yeah, to me, it's a rough 2024 schedule. Um, Now the expanded playoff field helps, but I think, John, this is a little bit indicative of what Penn State can kind of expect moving forward, right? Because you're not always going to get Rutgers and Maryland, and there won't be divisions anymore. That's the other thing now officially, because there were some thoughts of maybe there would be divisions for the last couple months. So no divisions. You're taking the top two teams from their conference records will meet for the Big Ten title game, and they still have to figure out the tiebreakers. That hasn't been announced yet because I feel like we're probably going to end up in some rabbit hole scenario next year where it's like some crazy tiebreaker that no one ever thought would happen, and like that's going to be the new lay of the land. But I do think this is also just kind of the byproduct of how these schedules are going to work. I mean, you've got big time monster programs in this 18 team Big Ten conference. You're going to have to play some of these places. I know you talk about atmospheres, and you hit on it a little bit earlier too. Like we've seen Purdue get revved up for some of those, I believe they call them blackout games. So you have that. Penn State lost at Minnesota the last time they were there. I just think you have to keep all of this in mind that like it's going to be a lot of fun. I think if you're a Penn State fan, yes, 2024 is going to be a tough schedule, but also, John, and again, so much of this is going to be dictated on, I'm sure, the TV times and all that we don't know. But like, who is your whiteout opponent when essentially you've got Ohio State, UCLA, and Washington to choose from? I'll let Illinois and Maryland off the hook. But like those are your three basically to choose a whiteout from, all very good options for various reasons. Um, but I think the other part of this too is you got to figure out the travel for these other teams, right? Like you look at it, man. I was looking at USC's schedule today, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, like this is. But again, we knew this was coming, and we're not gonna see the scheduling done for football where with divisions, like, it's not gonna happen, like, these guys are gonna be going back and forth across the country, so I am excited about it, but yeah, I totally understand if fans are revved up about 2024, and I don't know, John, what do you think the odds are that Penn State opens, Big Ten play on the road in 2024?
If they open on the road against USC, it would be hard not to laugh at that point, right? Like,
Yeah,
it would
gosh,
be very
yeah.
funny, given how this has gone. I don't know that
I don't
that
think
has
it'll
all that much
happen,
impact
but
anyways. Like,
yeah.
what's the difference if your third game's on the road or at home? Whatever. But yeah, like,
Selfishly, I'm saying let's go to USC in November.
yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, send
Let's go
send
to
them to
Minnesota
USC.
early on. Yeah.
That's right. Minnesota, let them open on the road against Minnesota, uh, as long as it's like before October 1st. That's fine by me. Same with Purdue, quite frankly, and Madison, Wisconsin. But no, I think this is, you're right. Like, this is the reality of the Big Ten now. Um, but I
The
think the
Big
reality is
18, yeah.
closer to, yeah, the Big 18. I think it's closer to three of these teams a year, maybe four, but getting five like is tough, right? Like, they're getting three of the new additions in the first season, and they're also getting Ohio State in a road game in Camp Randall. Like, I don't know who they upset at the Big Ten office, but like, this is this is a brutal first go, especially like, this might be the best team of the James Franklin era
Mhm.
next season, assuming Drew Aller takes the steps that we think he can, assuming some of these young guys really start to come into their own. That might be the best group overall that we've seen. And if that group has to face, this schedule, which it will at this point, like, I understand the playoffs expanding, but
Mhm.
you got to go 3-2 in those games to me to make it to the playoff, which I think is
Yeah.
feasible. By the way, I think, you probably still end up beating Wisconsin. You probably still get UCLA, and then you just got to go 1-2 in Ohio State, Washington, USC. Which, frankly, like, they should be good enough next year. They could go 12-0, right? Like, I don't think just because the schedule's hard that's outside the realm of possibility.
Right.
I want to be clear. I'm not saying that this is like, oh, these teams are on another level. It's just there are more teams that are on the elite level with them, right? That they're going to struggle with, or may struggle with, I should say. But yeah, I think it's definitely opening the world to a 9-3 playoff team. I think next year, right? If you look
Yeah.
at it, like, if Penn State loses to USC and Wisconsin on the road and loses to Washington at home, but has wins over Ohio State and UCLA, like, there are weird situations here that I think we're going to have to confront next year that are going to be really interesting. But I do think, like, this expanding to 12, we said that Penn State was pretty much going to make it every year once it expanded to 12. At least I've always
Yeah.
thought that they've always been on the brink
They
of
were gonna
that.
be one of the biggest beneficiaries of it for sure.
Yeah, and now I don't know that that's as guaranteed as maybe as I had originally thought, just because of the difficulty of the schedule. And
That's
like,
true.
if they change it to five automatic qualifiers instead of six, and seven at larges get in, then it's, you're probably looking at teams like 4 through 10 in the country that are getting in. And I don't know, I can see them being 14th one year and being on the outside looking in.
Here's the other part of this, John. Hey, you're not getting Ohio State every year. A lot of people were like, okay, whatever, that's great, that's relief. Well, now you're getting Ohio State a little more frequently than we thought. But the years in which it lines up the way in which Penn State plays Ohio State, they don't also play Michigan that year. So you have some balance there. Uh, but
You're getting one of them every year though. And like,
yeah,
and
like
you're also getting a West Coast trip, and you're also getting a West Coast team most years at home. 4 of the 5 years. Actually, no, sorry, all 5 years they're getting at least one West Coast team at home.
and you're not going to Nebraska until 2028, which is just I know a lot of fans have grumbled about that one, and I totally get it.
I
Penn
want to
State
go.
I say I was only out there once because I didn't during the 2020 season. I was like, I am not going out to Lincoln just to do interviews on Zoom. So I didn't go in 2020, and I did go the previous time, which I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, was the Matt Lehman fumble game. I believe that was
Which
the fumble.
which for those of us a little younger, that was, I think, my
Oh
senior
no!
year of high school.
Oh no! I was
I
gonna say, was
think
this like
maybe
your
my
super sweet 16th birthday
yeah,
party or
I think
something?
I listen, it was probably pretty close. I think that was what,
Yikes!
10, 11 years ago,
Yeah,
something
I
like
wanna
that.
say that because they joined the conference in 2011, and I wanna say were they out there in, I think, 14? I should know, I wrote this. Um,
No,
but
but either way, this is a trip that, like,
it's a bucket
it's one
list
of,
trip.
Yeah, it's a place you wanna go, and, like, I saw that, and I was kinda bummed out because I mean, it's a very common sports writer thing to complain about things like this, but, like, I enjoy going to all these new venues, and having that one being pushed so far out,
And I'll tell
is
you what, my
unfortunate.
travel getting there was such a mess that, like, I got there the night before the game at, like, 10, 11 o'clock, so I really didn't
Ooh,
get the full experience. Um, I remember it just because again, like, getting to these places is gonna be a wild ride for us and for these teams. I remember that particular trip, all the beat writers, we were all talking the week before of like, "Yeah, how are you getting to Lincoln? How are you?" And, like, everyone had a different flight pattern. I remember I got stuck that day in Denver for several hours. Like, it was just one of those weird trips, which is gonna become the norm. But yeah, I guess Penn State fans are just meant to have to wait a really long time to cross that one off the bucket list. But,
well, let's
I
be
mean, but
real, it's
Nebraska's been here a lot.
2028. Yeah, let's be real though, it's 2028. Do we think the schedule's gonna look like that in 2028? Like, are
Well,
we confident that
according
that trip
to,
will even happen?
God, according to my highly scientific Twitter poll that I asked people today, what's more likely that the schedule stays the same in 2028 or that I get replaced by a robot? Right now, the me getting replaced by a robot is winning by a landslide. So I don't know if
I'm not gonna
folks are
lie.
rooting for that or
I
just no confidence in
contributed
the schedule.
to that side of the vote simply out of curiosity as to what the results were. Uh,
Yeah.
but honestly, like, yeah,
It's
I
robot in a
don't think
landslide.
yeah, I think there's a better chance that, like, I don't know, one of these teams that's currently in the Big Ten is not in the Big Ten anymore than 2028, remaining the exact same from now until then, whether it's through other expansion, whether it's through teams. I don't think teams would leave for another conference because of the financial aspect of it. But I do
Notre
think, like,
Dame,
there's a
if
world
ever.
where, yeah, like, you're looking at, like, if Notre Dame decides to make a decision or an ACC team does or what have you, like, there's all sorts of stuff that can happen that we don't see coming because if you'd have
Rutgers
told us
gets
5
kicked out, and that is a joke. That is
yeah.
I am
That'll
not
go over well.
yeah.
But if you told me in 2018 that Penn State would be playing like an annual West Coast game for
It's
conference
insane.
play, I would have said you were crazy. Like I said, there was no way this would have happened. So I think it goes to say, like, who knows what this is going to look like in 2028. It's great that they have a plan in place. We'll see if it
For
sticks.
now. Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean,
then put it.
it's gonna be great to see Washington here, it's gonna be great to see Oregon here, like, it's gonna be awesome for us to get these West Coast trips, um, but also, like, what the hell are we doing, right? Like, there's I'm still not over that shock from this summer, honestly, like, to me,
Yeah,
it's still hard to wrap our head around all of this. And, I hear so much from fans that are saying, like the sport that you grew up loving and the rivalries, right? I mean, there's 12 protected rivalry games, which I think the Big Ten did a really nice job with preserving those. So you're still getting those. But again, for a team like
why did
Penn
they not?
State,
Why did they not protect USC, Washington, Oregon,
mhm,
and UCLA all playing each other? Like, that felt
yeah.
like such an easy thing to make sure travel was easier.
And it feels like to me like they wanted to make this as balanced as possible, which again, when you've got 4 teams on one side of the country, like I mean, because even if you think back to when the Oregon and Washington news came out, one of the comments that James Franklin had made was, "Yeah, I think it just got easier for USC, or not easier, but it's a little bit better scheduling wise for USC and UCLA because you've got teams in closer proximity." But that's not what we're seeing play out here, which I think is really gonna be bizarre, but also, like, selfishly, it's nice to see different venues. I think Penn State fans will love it. I think it's gonna be really cool for West Coast fans to come here and get to experience Beaver Stadium. But yeah, this is the new reality, and who the hell knows if any of it sticks. But there is a plan in place for 2024, and then, of course,
Just
we
like
still
there
have to get
was
dates and times.
just like there was a plan in place in June or whenever it
June.
was
Yeah,
for
June 8th. I
2024.
looked at that today.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, I was looking up a bunch of bylines, to try and find what we had all written then, but no, I think you're right. I think today it became like, expansion became reality for me, like, seeing the
Yeah.
schedules that kinda set in, like, on Big Ten Network, they're talking about Oregon and Washington. I think it set in, but yeah, no, it's gonna be interesting to see how this plays out. Fortunately for Penn State, they have another season to play out until then. They do not have to worry about that 2024 schedule until next year. Right now, they got to worry about the 2023 one, and that means the bye week, or as James Franklin liked to call it, the idle week.
Not a week
Made
off.
sure to mention, yeah,
Not a
not an
week off.
off week, as he said over and over
Gotta
again.
get better this week, not an off week.
That's right. But we spoke to James this week. We spoke to offensive coordinator Mike Yurcich. defensive coordinator Manny Diaz, special teams coordinator Stacy Collins, and strength and conditioning coach Chuck Losey. And I thought, got some really interesting stuff. I think the newsiest stuff off the top here is some of the stuff that James said. If you want to
Mhm.
go through some of the injuries that he mentioned post practice,
Yeah,
or maybe not
so
injuries that he mentioned, injuries that he either didn't mention or hinted at or kind of talked around a little bit.
yeah, I'll do my injury deciphering right now. This
Yeah,
I'll put on my medical cap here. Katron Allen was at practice when we were there Wednesday night, which is a good sign. Obviously, didn't finish out the Northwestern game, so he was out there in pads going through practice. Like very good sign there. I did not see JB Nelson during our viewing window at practice. James Franklin was asked afterward about JB Nelson and essentially if there's anything that he would share on his status moving forward. And James Franklin said, like the last 9 years, unless someone is out with a season ending injury, he's not going to talk about it. So we can decipher that it's not a season ending injury for JB Nelson based off of that response. So that is good news for Penn State. Trey Wallace, we've seen him practicing when we've been there for most of the season. So he was out there again Tuesday night or Wednesday night. Gosh, I don't even know what day it is. Wednesday night, he was out there at practice. And then James Franklin was asked about kind of Wallace's health moving forward and what this season's been like for him because he's been listed questionable a bunch. James Franklin said, "Well, actually, Wallace was full go at Northwestern, but then he got stepped on and the injury got tweaked." So
yeah,
that
and
was
I
the
think
most
like
insight we've gotten into why he
yeah,
is out there.
it's so interesting to in some of these responses, right? Because he shut down the season-ending thing with JB Nelson pretty quickly,
Mhm.
and then I
And the
asked
question
about
was
the
asked
Wallace thing, and
perfectly.
like
Yeah.
yeah, and the question was about JB Nelson was asked perfectly. That exactly what did
Friend of
exactly that
show,
mean to
Tyler
you?
Donahue did a great job,
That's right.
asked about it. James just
Tyler always does a
wasn't.
great job. But yeah, it was and it then I was looking for an avenue to see what we could get about Trey Wallace, asked about like how he's handling not playing. And James doesn't talk about injuries and hasn't for 9 years, but also he tweaked the injury in Northwestern and like
Yeah.
was gonna play and they
Got
expect to
stepped
have
on
him
and tweaked
available.
it. So
Yeah.
yeah, and I mean, and the thing is, because this is something that I hear a lot about from fans, and I'm sure you do too, John. It's like, well, he's not going to talk about injuries, so why do you guys ask? And like, that's our job. We want to know. Fans want to know. And the other side of that is, if we don't
Sometimes he
ask,
does ask or
yeah,
tell us,
sometimes he
by the
will
way.
tell us. And
Like,
if
this is an example of the Trey Wallace thing of him telling us something when we asked about it. So it's tough to gauge.
Yeah, you don't know, so you have to ask. I mean, like it's kind of Smith Vilbert, who we know is out for the year. Like we did not know that until literally I was looking to go talk to him at media day in August, and they're like, "Yeah, he's not here. He's out for the year," and we've known this. But like, so again, unless you ask specifically about a player, you're not going to get an answer. So all things considered, sounds like things are going well on the health front for Penn State. Again, we'll have to see what it means for JB Nelson moving forward. But a good sign with Katron Allen, a good sign with Trey Wallace. Um, Malik Mega has been out there practicing when we've been there as well. So I don't know what's going on there, but again, that's something for UMass week to monitor. But yeah, you had mentioned John Saturday night when we were out by the airport recording that you had mentioned something I thought was really interesting about Mike Yurcich's offense and how much of this is the same offense that we had seen before, and you didn't think much of it was similar compared to what he had done at previous stops. And so you asked Mike Yurcich about that on Tuesday, and what did you learn, John?
Not a ton, but which I don't know that I
It's a
expected.
blended offense, right? I think
Yeah, it's
that's
a
the
blended offense, right? No, I think man of my word. I said I wanted to ask him, got the opportunity to ask him, and I asked him. I thought his answer was interesting, though.
yeah.
He talked about like, and a lot of coaches say this now, and I think it's the right outlook, probably, right? I'm not a coach; it's not for me to decide that, but I think uh, he mentioned the idea of maximizing your talent, right? Like
Mhm.
maximizing whatever you have. If you have great receivers, you want to maximize receivers. If you have great running backs, same thing, tight ends, what have you. And so I think that is the first indication that maybe this is not the. I'm not. I don't want to put words in his mouth. He did not say this. This is me. My conjecture on the situation that maybe this isn't the idealized form of what the offense would be. Right. This is what the offense looks like when you have elite running backs and elite tight ends and a really good offensive line, and maybe not as much receiver talent as you would like to have. Um, because I do think if they had more elite receiver talent, and I think Keandre Lambert Smith, Trey Wallace are both very, very talented, very, very good receivers who are more than capable of being number one receivers. And Keandre has so far this year. But I think, the lack of a third guy stepping up so far, and even with Wallace being out so far, has made it so they've leaned on the running game. They've leaned on the tight ends. They've leaned on guys other than those. I keep bringing them up, but like the deep crossers with receivers, those deep shots. And so I think this is an indication that maybe the offense doesn't look like this in its perfect form, but for this team, this might be the perfect form.
Yeah, for this personnel, and I think, I mean, James Franklin had mentioned it in the spring and in the summer, and it sounded like a public challenge at that point with, "Hey, we're gonna run more 12 personnel if our tight ends are better than that third receiver," and we've seen that so far, right? Like, we've seen a lot of that. One quote that I did find to be very blunt, very honest from Mike Yurcich, he was asked about the timing between Drew Aller and the receiving core and how it looked off, and I pulled the quote up, so I have it right here in front of me. And Mike Yurcich said, "It's a big concern with me right now and us as an entire staff. We've got to remedy that fast. We've got to be on point with our landmarks and depths of routes and our timing. That is something we're going to address, and that is a big issue we have to clean up." So again, very forward that the timing is off. I asked Mike Yurcich about the lack of explosive plays, and he said that he's not satisfied with that either. He knows they have to be more explosive. They're working hard on it, he mentioned, which is something James Franklin had mentioned as well, that, some of that's been based off of the coverages that they've seen. But he said that's some of that's on him, as a play caller to kind of make sure you're in better situations. Because again, at some point, this offense is going to have to be more explosive. They're aware of the problems. The buzzword this week was self scout. I asked James Franklin Wednesday night if there was anything. I didn't expect he'd actually give me an answer to this, but if there was anything that maybe surprised him about the self scout, or maybe something that he learned about the team that, he didn't anticipate. And he said, nothing that he wanted to share in that forum, right? So I was kind of dangling the carrot and he wasn't taking it, right? But that all of the things that we've talked about, which really has been the run game, the explosive offense. He didn't say those things, but all the things that we've talked about, like that's held true in self scout. So they know what the problems are. They kind of know what they need to fix with that offense. And this week is about getting it done, right? And so much of this weekend for the team will be about recovery, and the coaches are out on the road already. They were hitting the road after practice Wednesday night, so they're recruiting. But for the players, it's about rest and kind of getting ready for this stretch run here. Manny Diaz,
Quote of the week, I thought.
definitely quote of the week. He was
I
asked about his thoughts on Ohio State because remember, James Franklin left that door slightly ajar after the Northwestern game, saying they were going to do the self scout this week, but also start working ahead to Ohio State. So he was asked about his thoughts on Ohio State. How did it go, John?
See, I'm curious that you went this direction because
Uh-oh.
the actual I'll let you rephrase what this quote was, because I thought the actual quote of the week was in his opening statement, which you did a great job, by the way, of following up on, when he said that the team is
Oh,
starting
okay.
to find the soul of its defense, which is a very like a I
Yeah.
don't know, it feels like a philosophical way to view what is going on with the defense. And to clarify that quote,
John and I
he
are not on the same page. That's what this is
listen,
this
that's
is
fine.
showing.
We both have very different sense of humor, as evidenced
Yeah.
by all the jokes Audrey makes that I don't laugh at. But what
Sometimes they
he
don't land.
that's right. He clarified. He said, "A defense is a collection of people. It's collective of individuals." I felt like against West Virginia and even part of Delaware, I felt like we were trying to be perfect, maybe a little tight. Then he goes on to say later in the quote, "I really think the first quarter, second quarter of Illinois, when all these plays started coming, I think that kind of relaxed us a little bit, and we started having fun, and we look like we're having a lot of fun right now." Then he finished later with, "I think we're seeing a lot more of the 11 guys becoming one unit." And that is like one, again, soul of our defense thing is a chef's kiss quote, like
Yeah.
just beautiful stuff to me. But I think it's really interesting, right? Because it is an indication that this is maybe what we've said in after Northwestern is what's coming true, right? This is a group that is really starting to hit its stride. And if you ask me, there isn't a better time for it to be hitting its stride.
No, I'm with you. Because yeah, I did when he said that. Like I had a different question initially in mind that I was going to ask, and then he said that, and I was like, "Well, you're putting it on the tee for me, so I got to follow up on that one." And I think you're right. I mean, this is a very confident defense, and he pointed to the Northwestern game. He's like, "Listen, we're down early in that game. It's not going according to plan, but the defense was confident. They were excited. He said they were in a really good headspace." And I mean, I just find Manny Diaz to be a really fascinating interview. I mean, you can certainly tell like he's got the head coaching experience, kind of knows how to play the media game in terms of uh, giving like introspective answers, kind of knowing what talking points to hit on. Just really smart and savvy with that type of thing. But yeah, that you're right. That was really interesting. And one of the things that Manny said in the preseason that I remember talking to him about at length at media day in August was he said he didn't want the players to feel like they have to wear too many capes, right? He doesn't want all these guys running around like they're Superman. It's just about doing your job and doing your job well. And yes, it sounds simplistic, but there's also that belief of like, yeah, he felt that guys were maybe pressing, being a little tight early on. But now they're kind of starting to round into form, which again, you're spot on, John. Like this is the time of year you want to be starting to hit your stride as a defense, and they're doing that. Um, but the part that I found to be absolutely hilarious was when he was asked about his thoughts on Ohio State, because again, the door was open, and Manny Diaz said, my opinions about Ohio State are absolutely very strong, and they're absolutely going to stay to myself.
That is a head coach answer if I've ever heard one. Like that is giving away
I
absolutely nothing. And I get it. Like, these
Yeah.
guys don't want to, coaches tend to think that they tend to want to take every advantage they can get. Right. And
Mhm.
this
Perceived
is
or
just,
otherwise, yeah.
yeah, like this is just part of it. This is, uh, the kind of the
But
fear that
hey,
Ohio State will hear it, that they'll enact on it. Who knows? Maybe they will.
well,
Maybe
you know what?
I don't
And
know.
this was because I had a couple friends who cover Ohio State who'd reached out because obviously this he says this, we tweeted out, and the quote kind of makes its rounds. So yeah, the quote made its way over to Ohio, and people there are like, "What does he mean?" And it's like literally like it almost felt to me like it was a little tongue in cheek and kind of just But I'd love to know what Manny Diaz really thinks about Ohio State's offense. We're never gonna know. I mean,
I'm
that's
gonna
kind of
guess
part of the job, right? Like, we'll see when we see the game plan like everybody else when they go out there on October 21st.
he thinks Marvin Harrison Jr. and Emeka Buku are really good. Uh,
Bold, hot,
and
scorching take.
Yeah, spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen Ohio State play, he'd be correct. They are.
Yeah.
It's going to be a very fun matchup. We're what 2.5 weeks away from that already. It's kind of crazy that we're
Yeah. Gosh,
at
I
that
my
point in the
calendar's
season.
still on September, John. I'm a mess.
Yeah, listen,
It's
that checks out. My brain is still in September too.
But
But
I do know the game is the 21st. If not, I've been
yes,
writing and saying it wrong
I
for
was
like the
gonna
last
say
2 weeks.
I've been putting that in too many stories for it to not be true at this point. So if it isn't true, nobody tell me.
And
But we also heard from Stacey Collins this week, as we mentioned, who had an assessment of the kicking game. I thought one of the things that was
mhm.
interesting that he said is he was asked about like if they have a line like in the past where if they get past a certain yardage, would they go to Sanders Sahaydak? Like, is that a possibility? Because we've only seen Falcons out there for the last few weeks. And he said the quote from him was, there's been weeks at times where we have a line of demarcation. Some of it's weather. A lot of that stuff we come up on pregame to get a feel for where we're at. That's always in the game plan. We look at that weekly. We have some distances that we look at each week, how they're hitting it, and then we go into that game day and make a final decision before we head into the locker room, which to me indicates pretty clearly that there is a world where Sahaydak goes out and kicks I don't know, 53 yarder, 55 yarder, like if they need it. I think this very clearly didn't just open the door, it made it abundantly clear that this is not just Alex Falcon's job right now.
Yeah, and he said, and teammates have said it too, that Sanders been performing well in practice. And I thought when Alex Falcon said it after the Illinois game when I was talking to him, he was really honest. He's like, "Yeah, we need Sander to be ready to go because what happened to him could happen to me." And I was like, "Yeah, I don't think that's what fans want to hear, but it's true." I mean, I think he brings a good level of reality to the position. But yeah, so it sounds like things are progressing there. I got my burning question in to Stacey Collins, the question that I I was
I don't
just
know that
really
I've ever
curious
seen this
about.
before still. Like, I think this is the
I
first
I
time I've
haven't
ever
either,
seen.
and that's why I asked. I mean, Penn State started the second half with a delay of game penalty on the opening kickoff, and originally in the box score, they said it was a penalty on Penn State. Then they went back and said it was a penalty on Northwestern, but then in the final box, it was a penalty on Penn State. So I wanted to make sure that we had that accurate before, before I asked James Franklin about it after the game. So I held off, waited to ask Stacy Collins, and he said yes, it was a penalty on Penn State that Gabe Nwosu like has his progression where he, how he warms up, and the clock started, and they just were not ready to kick the ball off, which is a glaring issue. Again, one of the things that was so crazy, I've never seen it before. You said you've never seen it before, like just a really bizarre thing. Um, so file that under the things that need to get cleaned up. But
Yeah, that's a pretty egregious mistake
uh,
too. Like, you're coming out of
yeah,
halftime. It's like it's I don't know. It's like coming out of the bye week unprepared or whatever, right? Like, it's the idea that you've had extra time to get ready for this, and you still can't kind of fully get it there. But yeah, no, I think like little stuff like that can be concerning. I think
mhm.
all in all, the special teams are kind of fine right now. I'm not overly concerned about where they're at for Penn State, but some of the disorganization like that can be something to monitor in bigger games in tougher environments. Keep going back to it, but at Ohio State is going to be their first like major road test of the year, and I think it'll be interesting to see how some of those guys who haven't maybe been in that situation handle that.
Yeah, and we also, we talked with because you're making me think punt returners now. We talked with Chuck Losey. He was asked about Caden Saunders. Obviously, so was Stacy Collins. And Saunders to me is just one of those interesting guys when you look at the receiving core and kind of how things are going to round up, not just this year, but down the road as well. And he's somebody that Chuck Losey said, yeah, like and we'd heard this before, that when he got here, obviously, he's a smaller guy, smaller frame, that he was so concerned with hitting a certain number for weight that he was like overweight, and so they spent most of last year retooling his body, but he's in a really good spot now. So again, like I think it's always interesting when we hear from Chuck Losey because there's no one who spends more time around these players than the strength coach. I mean, that's true at every college program. I mean, these are the guys day in and day out. And Chuck Losey is doing a really good job with all of these guys. And I asked him about Drew Aller and kind of what's his level of confidence or how impressed is he with Drew where he's at now, because we had heard it when Drew got here. Bo Prabula, in terms of a weight training perspective, was ahead of him. Just his background in it coming up was different than Drew's, and he's like, Drew wants to be trained hard. He's doing a really nice job there. Um, I believe he said he's playing at 235 right now, and that somewhere between 235 and 239 is kind of where they see him at. But obviously, bigger guy. We saw it with the tush push, the things that can happen when you've got that bigger quarterback. And that's also something Losi said that, yeah, the strength staff, they take some pride in that play and kind of seeing strength on strength and how it plays out. So I thought that was interesting as well. John, was there anything else from that I missed on from the strength
I,
staff?
I think Chuck mentioning that Tony Rojas, who we've heard mentioned a
Mhm.
lot, is up to 227 pounds after being under 200 when he got to Penn State. That's a pretty remarkable weight gain, and it's clearly all great weight because he's out there playing on special teams
Earned his
heavily,
red shirt,
rotating
yeah.
in. Yeah, the red shirt's already gone. I would not be surprised if he was playing more snaps defensively by the end of the season, I'll say.
Yep.
He mentioned Jameel Lyons as well, someone who can add a bunch of weight, who is like still looks like kind of thin, but is already up to 251 pounds. And you know,
That was a good point about Lions, because when I guess it was about this time last year, I went to Philadelphia and sat down with Jameel Lyons, and I mean, you gotta remember because 'cause I had forgotten this, he was a safety early on in his high school career. Like, this is somebody who went to camps, and his high school coach was like, "No, no, no, like, you're gonna be a defensive end," and he kind of fought that a little bit early on as a high schooler, but then was able to put it together. But yeah, definitely one of the more impressive physiques, and he's in that yellow category of guys who maybe burns a red shirt.
when
Um,
he was out
but he
last
was
week too.
yeah, say last week he was out on the availability report, which was notable. Pretty sure that was the first time he was on the report all year. But yeah, so that's always good to kind of take stock of where things are because again, you've got 110 guys, give or take, in a program. And there's just so many different weight gains and numbers that people are focused on and trying to hit. So I thought it was nice to kind of talk to the coordinators, talk to Chuck Losey, and get in some regards the bigger picture view of this thing, because as the season goes on, we are so all of us so tunnel vision, right? And we get so caught up in where's this guy, where's that guy, but you have to think to micro and macro. And I think that was kind of this was the week for us to do that.
Yeah, and those guys are maybe a little bit less stressed than they usually are, so it's easier on them to be, more big picture than they usually are. But no, I'm with you. I think this we got a lot of info out of this week that kind of sets the stage for the rest of the season. But let's take a dip into the mailbag here. We have a few questions we want to go over here before we call it an episode. Uh, let's start off with one that I think is really interesting because I understand the frustration with the player and the position in general. But there's a question. The preface. I get that he's not had much time in the program, but is it too much to ask that Dante Cephas make a couple of the tougher catches? And I get that. I understand that he's not making maybe some of the more difficult throws. The one I'm sure you think of it as well, the West Virginia one where he was open and he just kind of dropped it because the ball got
Mhm.
on him quick. Point blank, I don't know about you. I think he's just adjusting to the velocity still. Like he was not catching passes that were this hard at Kent State.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point because again, you have to remember Cephas wasn't here all spring, and I think that's part of this, right? Had he been here, in March, I think we're not seeing some of this. Like I think we're farther along had he been here longer. Um, yeah, I think it's fair to expect more, to want more based off of, how highly coveted he was in the transfer portal. That this is somebody that right away I thought he could potentially be their number one. Now part of that is Keandre Lambert Smith has been doing a really nice job. But the other part of that is, yeah, the production hasn't been there. We've seen him take on that starting role, but again, I think this thing is going to take a little bit more time. Going back to what Mike Yurcich said, like, yes, they're concerned. I thought there was an interesting moment at practice Wednesday. We did get to see some one-on-one reps, and James Franklin pulled Cephas aside, and it was a really good teachable moment, because again, like, I think so often we forget that so much of coaching is teaching, and like we don't always see that, right? Because you're there for 15, 20 minutes and it's in and out and it's crazy, and maybe somebody's yelling at somebody and whatever. But he pulled Cephas aside, and James Franklin was like, listen, like, no, like if you do this, it's going to get called every single time. You put your hand here, do it this way. And I just thought it was one of those teachable moments that I'm sure there are so many of those that are happening with Cephas on the practice field, especially right now, that eventually I think it's going to click, because I think, quite frankly, he's too good for it not to. Um, but I get the frustration, but I would just say be a little bit more patient, which I know the clock is ticking.
Right.
Ohio State's coming, and I get it. But I think there's just so much of that happening behind the scenes right now.
Yeah, I'm still a major believer in Cephas. Like I think there's a chance by the end of the year. I think I've said this before that we're talking about 1A and 1B and 1C with him, Trey Wallace, and Keandre Lambert Smith. I think he's
You
really
want
talented.
co-starters? Is that what I hear?
Yes, that's right.
And
Uh,
introduced on the Beaver Stadium video boards as such
yes, all three on the
at
exact
the same
same
time.
frame. Yeah, at the exact same time. But I think patience is necessary. I know it's 5 games in, but it's 5 games into his Power 5 career, essentially,
Mhm.
dealing with a Power 5 quarterback who really, really can put some zip on the ball. You mentioned that teaching moment, and I think it's a good sign of like, where like Cephas is kind of dealing with the different officiating and everything too, right? Like the fact that he's kind of being coached that hey, don't put your hand on in a certain spot if you're going to try and create separation because it gets called. Do it somewhere else. It can help him down the road, right? Maybe we see that later in games that it helps him out. But yeah, I think he's going to be fine. I don't think it's anything major to worry about. In fact, I think he's been a lot better the last few weeks. I think we've seen him take steps forward, and I think as that volume increases and that trust that you mentioned between Aller and his receivers gets better, I think that he'll get better.
And I
Uh,
think too, it's the Harrison Wallace part of this that we just haven't seen it all come together right now, just because there haven't been those moments where they've had everybody healthy. And I get it, it's a season and guys are going to be banged up here and there. Um, but to me, like, he's such a big part of the offense that we just got to kind of see it a little bit more together. But yeah, be patient with it, but yeah, if it's still problematic after Ohio State, then I expect it'll be still be asked about.
Yeah, if it's a problem by Michigan still, I think that's when it's time to be concerned. But to stick with the receivers, another question here. Do you think tightening the wide receiver rotation will help the position's performance? I've seen national media types point to Bama/OSU QB play improving following announcements that McCord and Milrow were the guys, that being Kyle McCord and Jalen Milrow, of course,
Mhm.
respectively. Uh, would having 3 to 4 quote unquote guys help Penn State's receivers' performance?
I mean,
They kind of have this already.
I feel like they're at this point where we've seen it in the snap counts, right? We've seen where they've got their top tier guys, but the problem is no one has separated enough to say, "Hey, I'm here. I've asserted myself. I am this guy." Besides Keandre Lambert Smith, right? Like to me, that's the thing. I wouldn't worry
Well,
about the snap
in
counts
Trey
as much.
Wallace. Like Trey Wallace is in that group too.
Oh
He's just
yeah, it's
dinged up.
just not out there. Yeah, I mean, I think like if we went right now, John, and said their top four receivers, I would go Keandre Lambert Smith. I'd go Trey Wallace. I would go Dante Cephas. And then 4 is where it gets interesting to me, right? 4 is where you say it's probably at this point still Liam Clifford. Amari Evans was somebody that was banged up early on this year. Maybe he becomes that guy. Maybe Saunders at some point becomes that guy. Like to me, it's so in flux right now. I mean, Malik McLean was that guy for a hot second. I mean, it's just they to me, it's not necessarily about tightening up the rotation because you're right. I do think they've done that. It's just getting someone to kind of step up.
Yeah, and I think that's all there is to it. I had asked
Do you
James
agree with my
Franklin.
top receivers, or am I wrong?
No, I think you're right. I think I'd probably lean. I mean, by the end of the year, I think it'll end up being
Oh, by
Amari
the end of the
Evans or
year.
Caden
Yeah,
Saunders. Yeah,
yeah.
but like right now,
Right
I think
now.
you have to say Liam Clifford. But honestly, I think the real answer is just the top three, right? Like
Yeah.
if you need the
Yeah.
top four, then well, it's a longer conversation that we have to work through some stuff. But I think they have a clear top three right now. And I think what like I was saying, Franklin mentioned at the beginning of the year when he's asked about it that they have guys that are the guys, right, who have to tap out essentially to not being on a play. And Keandre and Trey are both in that group, right? Like they have a Titan top two. It's just they haven't had the other guys step up to that point. I'd be curious to ask. This is not something we've asked James about recently. If Cephas is in that group, I think if we go into the UMass game and we see that he's once again out there a ton, I think it'll be worth asking, like, hey, is this the top three now? Because it seems that way, but they haven't said it. They've said that they have the top two and not the top three just yet. So
And
I
I don't
think
wanna
that is something worth monitoring.
I don't wanna spoil it because 'cause I'm sure we'll talk about it next week, but do you feel like the UMass game could maybe be like a get right game for Dante Cephas, for like a confidence builder? Could that be it?
I don't want to spoil too much of my writing next week, but yes, I think it could be a big time Cephas day. And if it's not, then maybe you have a little more concerns. But yeah, I think this could be the kind of game that he can really have an impact on and kind of have that kind of coming out party and show what he can do in a game.
So you heard it here first. UMass is the Dante Cephas game according to John Cyber of the Center
Listen,
Daily Times.
I'm already going to write it in the Center Daily Times over at centerdaily.com next week. So I may as well say it now. One final question from dear friend of the pod, David Eckert, Ole Miss reporter at the Clarion Ledger down in Mississippi, covers Lane Kiffin and company down there. This is a question from him for him, essentially. What is your all-time favorite snoil? And to explain to the listener, a snoil is when they play. I think it's the Pride of the
Floating
Lion. They come out.
Lions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the floating lion. Thank you. They come out and play it pregame, and from the press box, it looks like it says snoil because it's upside down. Because
Snoil. Yeah.
yes, because it's facing. It actually kind of says snowy 7, but we'll skip that part. That's no fun.
Yeah.
To answer the question, any away snoil, those are the good snoils, right? When you get an away snoil, that's when it's at its best. But appreciate David,
See,
appreciate
I
the
I'm
time
gonna go
here.
with the whiteout snoil. That's to me,
A
that's
whiteout
like the
snoil is a good
best
snoil,
snoil. Yeah, I mean,
and
that's because it really kind of pops that day, and the people are actually in their seats early because they want to see the pregame. So I'll go whiteout snoil, but also the helmet stripe snoil can be pretty good
it's a
too.
good snoil because
I
it's
mean, any
essentially a
night
whiteout.
game snoil. Yeah, any night game
Yeah,
snoil is good. Noon game
a nice
snoil, it's
snoil.
gonna be a little lighter.
Yeah, but no, this is one of my favorite things every game day is seeing you tweet when I also tweet at Eckert mentioning the Snoil with a photo of the Snoil.
This was his
Just with a
thing. I
nice miss ya
didn't
or
matter
something along
however
those
many
lines.
times, like, we looked at it, they've just looked at it and saw Snoil, and now I can't unsee Snoil, so I hope many of you listening now will kind of have that same
That's right.
experience, whether you're in your
I hope
seats in Beaver
we've ruined it for
Stadium.
you too.
Yeah, it's like you can't unsee it,
But no,
but
I
yeah,
think that
that's
shout out to Eckert and the great work he does. But I think that's a probably a good place to leave it for this week with a good old fashioned Snoil discussion. You can find Audrey on Twitter at OddSnyder4. You can find me at John Sauber, Audrey, of course, at The Athletic, where she writes about Penn State, me at SenderDaily.com. We'll have you covered for the rest of the season and the foreseeable future here. We will be back next week previewing the UMass game with maybe some more Dante Cephas discussion. We shall see. But until then, we'll talk to you soon.